So there's a lot of ways to add compost to the soil. You can buy it and spread it out and mix it in. You can make it yourself in bins. I find that the easiest way to make it is to use pathways to make compost. And I just spread leaves in pathways like this. Add more leaves as you walk on them and they sort of compress down. Add more leaves, and you can put a lot of leaves in a garden this way. And by the end of that growing cycle, everything that's in that trench is dark, chocolate brown, crumbling, falling apart. And you can use it in potting mixes. You can use it to hill up potatoes like we're doing here. It's just a lot of organic matter that decomposes pretty rapidly in our warm, moist climate of the garden. In this way, composting can be a lot of work, turning the piles, thermometers in it and everything. This is very little work, and if you employ child labor, it's no work at all. There's no child labor laws in the garden in Texas that I know of, so go for it. So for a productive garden, you want to spend time and money on your soil before you spend time and money on your plants. And that's the foundation of organic gardening, and it really is the foundation of all gardening in order to have good success. You want to give those plants what their roots need in order to grow. Now, there are a number of cultural techniques that are part of organic gardening, and we don't have time in this talk to go in depth on all of them, but we'll talk a little bit about, we've talked about soil building, we'll talk a little bit about resistant varieties and species, proper watering and moderate fertilizing, and crop rotation is important, we'll mention that. Companion planting and trap crops are a whole nother area. You find when it comes to science, there's not a lot of science behind most companion planting recommendations. There's a lot of hearsay that people have tried and things, but a lot of the things are based on truth but turn out to not be true. For example, putting a marigold next to a tomato doesn't keep nematodes off the tomato. Nematodes will go in the marigold root and they can't reproduce and they die, but the tomato roots are not going to be protected from the nematodes by the presence of the marigold. What'll happen is spider mites will turn the marigold to toast and then crawl up on your tomato plant. That's what happens. Trap crops can be used some. They're used in some different ways in agriculture to draw a pest off of the desirable crop onto something else so that you can grow the desirable crop without spraying it. Sanitation is important, and biodiversity. If you have taken the Master Gardener course, you're familiar with the disease triangle, which means that we have three things that have to be present in order for a plant to get a disease. You have to have a plant that can get sick. It can't be resistant, it's got to be susceptible for that plant to get the disease. So the way we knock out that side of the triangle is by planting resistant plants. You have to have the disease present. And the way we knock that out is by spraying and killing the fungus or the bacteria that we're going after. And you have to have the environment that's favorable for that to develop. And the way we would knock that side of the triangle out, for example, might be when you plant roses, don't crowd them all together where there's not good air circulation, or you're going to have more black spot. Don't have a sprinkler come on every other day and wet the foliage, because every time you wet the foliage, those disease spores start to infect the leaves and cause you the problems. And so by minimizing foliage wetting, we can minimize the incidence of disease. So let's look at resistance. Here's a row of tomatoes. Some of them are healthy and some of them are in bad shape. And they're in bad shape because of nematodes in that soil. Now we could say, what's an organic control for nematodes? And we have some options for reducing nematode numbers a little bit, not eradicating, but reducing their numbers in the soil that are organic options. But the real solution here is to plant a tomato with a little N after the name. You know how tomatoes have V, F, N, T, and letters like that? Each of those is a resistance to a particular problem. And by planting resistant plants, we have that. When we plant roses, don't plant roses that are so black spot susceptible that you have to stand there with a spray wand squirting them every few minutes to keep them alive. Plant ones that can take it here in Texas climate conditions and not get the disease. When you plant a crepe myrtle, they can get powdery mildew, but there's resistant varieties. The USDA bred varieties are all resistant to powdery mildew, and they have names of Native American tribes like Natchez and Choctaw and things like that. And so we plant resistant varieties whenever possible and avoid the problem. We water properly, which means a good soaking and then drying out. Not a squirt of water every other day. I've got a neighbor whose irrigation system comes on in Houston every other day. Now, you almost ought to never have to water your lawn in Houston. It rains so much down there. But it comes on every other day. And the heads are so misaligned that they squirt my car in the driveway and wash one side of my car. So I park backwards on some days so I can wash the other side of my car. But watering properly means, number one, if you can, use drip irrigation. Put the water on the soil where it goes. You save water and you avoid wetting the foliage. And don't overwater. Have good drainage. Drainage is important. If plant roots stay too wet, they're not going to survive well. They're going to get diseases. There are some soil diseases that have spores that swim like a tadpole in wet conditions. And so they live for wet conditions. And we give them that kind of condition and we end up with a problem. I was out at a place one time that had some shrubs that were dying in the middle of a long row. And I went out and looked, and the whole yard sloped down and drained right through the shrub row. And right where the wettest soil was is where the root rot dying shrubs were. Now we could ask, well, what's an organic control for root rot, which there's not a good one. Or we could just say, why not build that area up, have a culvert under it to drain, or do something to improve the drainage and avoid that problem altogether. We want to fertilize moderately. We have things like fish meal, cottonseed meal, blood meal that all have good nutrient content. But now, in the last few decades in Texas now, we have several fertilizers that have that good 3:1:2 ratio of nutrients or 4:1:2 ratio of nutrients. And so over in the Houston area, there's Microlife, that's a 6:2:4 fertilizer. In Austin, there's Ladybug, that's a 8:2:4 ratio. And these are sold in other cities as well. And these organic fertilizers release slowly and they're in the right ratio of nutrients, which is what we want to do. Don't just read something that says this particular thing is good for fertilizing and think that that's what you need at your house. Someone asked me the other day, should they fertilize their tomatoes with Epsom salt? Because they read online that Epsom salt's good for tomatoes. Well, it's good for tomatoes that need magnesium. But if you've already got plenty of magnesium, it's no use at all to put Epsom salt on them. So have a soil test done and then fertilize accordingly. And there's a lot of organic fertilizers on the market. There's Milorganite. Has anyone ever heard of Milorganite? Milorganite is from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and that's what the mill stands for. And organite means we're not going to tell you what this stuff is because it's sewage sludge from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. That, they're sitting there looking at piles of human waste and trying to decide what to do with it. Let's bag it up and sell it to Texans, put on their lawn. And so that's what happens. And one year at a Texas nurseryman show, I met a rep from Milorganite, and I told him I had the perfect marketing idea for them. That what they should do is put it in red, white, and blue bags and call it Yankee Doodle fertilizer. He didn't think it was as funny as y'all did. I thought it was a great idea. But when I was in Austin, my coworker, they have Dillo Dirt, which is the same thing from Austin. And my coworker said they ought to say there's a little of you in every bag on the label. It's a good idea. Okay, enough poop jokes. Crop rotation. Some soil-borne problems build up in the same family of crops over time, like southern blight on the nightshade family, which is tomatoes and peppers and eggplant. So by every few years, rotating that particular vegetable garden bed to a different family of crops, you help avoid that problem. And that's just crop rotation in a nutshell. Sanitation means don't bring problems in, and if you've got a problem, get it out. So I've pulled little 6-packs of plants up at the nursery to check the roots and found nematodes on them before. That's not a common problem because most people use good sterile soil-based soil medias that don't have nematodes, but don't bring a problem in when you can avoid it. And if you have a nectarine or a peach or something that dies with brown rot, that's a bag of spores wanting to reinfect the next crop. So clip it and get it out of there. When the fruit falls down because it has a worm in it, pick it up and discard it because you don't want to keep those insects right there in the orchard. to affect those plants. And sanitation just means getting diseases and things out of the garden.